Good afternoon or good evening, everyone. My name is Ryan Hauk. I direct the Global Classroom Program at the World Affairs Council in Seattle. And I'd like to welcome you to our 2021 Arctic Series, Indigenous Peoples, Climate Change, and the Environment. We are very grateful to have Chief Dana Tizya-Tramm as our keynote speaker to kick off our series and look forward to engaging you in a very, very important topic facing our local and global community. If you're a K-12 teacher or a community college professor, we also encourage you to sign up for our 5-part Arctic series, which will be starting on February 25th. This project has been in the works for many months, and I'd like to thank my colleagues at the World Affairs Council, especially Juliana Patterson, for their passionate work. Our mission is to bring the world into the classroom and into our communities, raising our global IQ and empowering citizens to be actively engaged citizens, able to take action on local and global issues. And certainly the Arctic is one of those issues. Please see our website at the World Affairs Council for upcoming programs. In addition to our colleagues at the Council, I'd also like to thank our amazing partners and sponsors who made this event possible. The Canadian Studies Center and the Center for Global Studies at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington have been incredible partners in putting together this program. I'd also like to thank the Consulate General of Canada and also the Center for Canadian American Studies at Western Washington University. I'm sure you will have many questions throughout the evening. My colleagues and I will monitor the Q&A throughout the program. So you can use the Q&A function on your screen to send questions to my colleagues, and we'll consolidate those. I would imagine that there'll be several questions, and so we'll do our best to get as many questions into the program, probably during the last 15 to 20 minutes. Now I'd like to introduce Nadine Fabi, Managing Director of the Canadian Studies Center at the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington. Nadine is also our lead on the Arctic International Policy Institute initiative in the Jackson School. Nadine is also the founder and editor of the Arctic and International Relations series, a publication that focuses on understanding the Arctic as a unique world region where Indigenous people, nation states, NGOs, and civil society are working together to create a distinctive Arctic voice. And I think tonight's program will definitely feature that. Please welcome Nadine Fabi.
Thank you, Ryan. And I am here to introduce our moderator, Professor Kevin Turner. And Kevin comes from Brock University in St. Catharines, Ontario, on the beautiful shores of Lake Ontario. And I want to welcome you, Kevin, as our 2021 Fulbright Canada Visiting Chair in Arctic Studies. This chair brings scholars, scientists, practitioners, and leaders who are involved in Arctic affairs to our university. And the chair, I want to thank the supporters of the chair position, and those are the University of Washington's Office for Global Affairs, the College of the Environment, the Division of Social Sciences and the College of Arts and Sciences, and the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies. And I'm very proud to say that our institution is one of just 2 in the United States that hosts such a chair, a Fulbright Canada Arctic Chair. So our moderator today is Professor Kevin Turner, and he is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Tourism Studies at Brock University. He's also the co-founder of the Water and Environment Lab there. His research focuses on tracking the impacts of a changing climate on northern landscapes and on water resources in the north, particularly lakes and rivers. He's been now on over 20 expeditions to the Canadian Arctic or subarctic, and the bulk of his research has taken place in Old Crow Flats in the Yukon. And interestingly, his career trajectory and the reason he's participating in this conversation today started some time ago in 2006, when he was recruited into a Government of Canada International Polar Year Research Program that was led by the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation. So Kevin, I want to welcome you. And I'd like to turn over now to our director of the Henry M. Jackson School of International Studies, Professor Leila Fernandez, who's going to say a few words on behalf of the school. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadine. I'm delighted to be here today to welcome all of you to this important program and to be working in partnership with the World Affairs Council. The program for today really intersects two of the most important intellectual missions of the Jackson School moving forward as we continue to build our school. And that has to do with a focus on climate change and the environment, particularly its impact on marginalized communities as well as poor countries in the global south, as well as our commitment to the rights and knowledge of Indigenous peoples throughout the world. And I think, as I've said to Nadine in recent weeks, the Arctic Studies is a critical site for the Jackson School because it brings together these two sets of issues. And it also makes us think from the perspective of international studies of regions in new and complicated ways, rather than some of the older ways in which we just thought about regions and sort of predefined nation states. And so the kind of work which you'll be foregrounding today in today's event is really critical. And I'm just really honored to be here to be able to introduce this program. And with that, I would like to introduce our distinguished guest, Consul General Brandon Lee, who's going to in turn introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Consul General Brandon Lee, the Consul General of Canada. I'd like to begin by saying that I am based in the unceded Duwamish and Suquamish territories here in Washington State. And as Consul General, I am Canada's most senior federal representative within the Pacific Northwest and to Alaska as well. I'd like to thank the World Affairs Council, of course, the Jackson School of International Studies at the University of Washington and Western Washington University for hosting this important event and this important conversation. The Canadian Consulate has great partnerships with all three of these organizations, and we've worked together on a wide range of issues like the Arctic, of course, global trade, and the border. The Arctic is one of the world's great economic, cultural, and environmental endowments. And the history of the region is alive in those who live there. And it's to those people, I believe, we can also look to for the future stewardship of the region. And with that, it's a real honor to introduce Chief Dana Tizya-Tramm, who is also my friend and whom I had the honor to visit with in the Vuntut Gwitchin heartland of Old Crow in 2018 at his kind invitation. And Chief Tiziatram was elected chief of the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nations in the northern Yukon territories in 2018. He took office in January of 2019, and he has truly been a tireless champion for the protection of the calving grounds of the Porcupine Caribou Herd in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. And these caribou are very much at the center of the Gwitchin existence, both spiritually, culturally, as well as a primary food source for the people of the region. And for decades now, the government of Canada has joined the Vuntut Gwitchin with clear conviction and efforts to safeguard one of the last great migrations on this planet. So we hope that we are closer to that realization today. So whether we are meeting in Old Crow or here in Seattle, it's always a great pleasure to welcome you, Chief Dana, and hear your message with open ears and an open heart.
Shitja Council General Brandon Lee Masicho, Drintlan Gwinzi Shalaknai, Bajri Dana Tizya-Tramm, Chitna Lee Vuntut Gwitchin Ojri. Thank you, my friend and partner, Brandon Lee, as well. Good day to you, all of my relations. My name is Dana Tizya-Tramm, and I am the chief of the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation. I very much look forward to today's discussion, as coming from an Indigenous peoples with an oral history stretching back to the Beringia periods. The voice that I speak with you today, Yendu Dijak, my voice comes from long ago, as my ancestors labored and thrived in an inhospitable environment. And they carried my voice all the way to today, and is the birthright of my grandchildren. So I speak to you today with not just that of my own voice, but I will effort and strive today to get out of the way of the truths that resonate throughout the land and have been identified by my people to reach all of you today. Masi.
And thank you very much to all of you, and thank you very much for the detailed intros. And I'm very much looking forward to taking part in this chat as well. Before we really get into it, I would like to take the opportunity just to build on the introduction a little bit. I am Kevin Turner, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the land where I'm meeting you from today. It's my institution, Brock University, is just down the street from me in St. Catharines, Ontario, and is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, many of whom continue to live and work here today. In acknowledging them and the many other First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people who also reside here reminds us that our great standard of living is directly related to the resources and friendship of Indigenous people. And now I have to travel in my mind, because there's no other way these days, to over 4,000 kilometers from wine country, Ontario, to the North Yukon, the traditional territory of the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation. I've been incredibly lucky to have many opportunities to experience Old Crow and Old Crow Flats since beginning that first research program entitled Yindu Nan Nakwinjit Kachar Hanacha, which translates to Environmental Change and Traditional Use of Old Crow Flats, Canada. Just to give you a sense from the science side, what we focus on, or how my research program has evolved since being a grad student and into career-wise at Brock University, is we inventory changing landscape conditions because of changing climate. And some of those landscape changes include thaw slumps, which can be thought of as landslides, fire, changing vegetation, land cover, and also drained lakes, which is something that we might talk about a little later. And the way that we do this is we use satellite imagery, we use airborne imagery, we'll use drones in the field when we can make it out there. And in addition to that, we'll couple those measurements with measurements on the ground, especially in lakes and rivers, where we use chemistry and measurements of sediment and water to understand how changing landscape features influence the lakes and the rivers, the biogeochemical cycling, and what that means for downstream environments, as well as the interactions with the atmosphere. So that's the science side, but I'm quite thankful for the support and trust of the Vuntut Gwitchin. They've placed a great deal of trust in me as I've conducted research in their traditional territory. And I would like to start by saying Drin Gwinzi to Chief Dana Tizya-Tramm and Masi Cho for joining me for this chat. We come from very different backgrounds, but we converge on this appreciation of the importance of your traditional territory and the people who have called it home for many or countless generations, really. And I'll just say to the people who are tuning in that most of our conversations generally go well beyond an hour and naturally go in different directions. I have a layout here, and I'm just really looking forward to seeing how this unfolds. So Dana, if maybe for everybody, if you would like to help orient people with the location of Old Crow and points of, or important points of the background information of the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation, I think that would be a great way to kick things off.
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Dr. Turner. The community of Old Crow, which our people teach a fishing community at the turn of the 20th century. It was not where we permanently had resided, but it is located 80 miles north of the Arctic Circle in northern Yukon and 60 miles east of the Alaska border. However, the nation of our people, which stretches back to before the written word of man, before wheat had tamed man in the Fertile Crescent, we had stretched from northeast Alaska through northern Yukon and into the NWT. Our borders of our nation are in direct correlation with the migratory routes of the caribou. In fact, over 14 of our villages are aligned with the traditional migratory routes of the Porcupine Caribou. So I think the caribou Vetsai is going to be a common theme as we continue, as it was our people who, it is said through our time in our histories, that when we had first noticed the caribou in coming to these lands, likely 30,000 years ago or possibly more, it was our observation of the caribou and helped to teach us to navigate these lands. And we followed them to the migratory grounds in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, or known to our people as the sacred place where life begins, which is the calving grounds of the caribou. So our disposition in time and space is in complete reference to the caribou and to the land, in how we interact with one another as well. And I think that in a small, humble village, we are the only fly-in rural community in the Yukon territory. There's no other settlement for hundreds of miles, which allows us to insulate from the modernization of the world. We only got electricity in about 1973. So we still have an incredible opportunity within our village, not only for our children to continue to teethe on caribou bones, our elders to be given choice cuts of the meats, but for us to keep our connection to the land, to be out in the living sciences, that is the ecologies in our areas. And we are still very close to those opportunities in education that the land brings and that presence. So although today in modern times, we may refer to these lands within the jurisdiction of Canada or even the United States, our people still hold on to very ancient truths that I believe that many of our modern day tools can benefit from, our modern day systems. And we, as always, we very much understand the strength and power of our partnerships. And we thank both the Canadian government for their long time standing with us, and especially the incoming Biden administration as well, the US administration. We look to forge those partnerships. And I hope so to do as well today as somewhat of an ambassador of our regions, our lands, and our people, to create those pathways, those connections between our hearts. And just to finish off that introduction, I think a very great way to describe and show our people is that when we did sit with the caribou in these regions, it is said that the Gwitchin man had shared a piece of his heart with the heart of Vetsai, our brother caribou. And in this way that we were always connected. So it is my hope today that we each have this opportunity to share a piece of our heart with one another, as we are all connected.
Absolutely. Thanks very much for that intro. And you speak of partnerships, and just right off the bat, that is something that is absolutely crucial, and not just during a year of a pandemic, but like crucial for our research, whether it's logistics or and really getting these long-term monitoring programs from the science side. Now, you speak of such a rich traditional knowledge that's been passed down, and with the partnerships that need to make our side go, like it's absolutely imperative to have the VGG, the Vuntut Gwitchin government, as well as Parks Canada, helping push our side forward to keep the monitoring going. And we're hoping that in some way that we can provide our end of the bargain, our side of the partnership, and provide the information that can certainly complement the traditional knowledge that you speak of. And you've mentioned, actually, maybe before I get into this, I'm just going to share my screen and show people, just to give them a sense of what Old Crow Flats looks like, and you're more than welcome to comment on some of this. But this is just a typical map template that we'd be using. It doesn't have the traditional names on it, and that should likely change in the future when we're publishing. But this is, just for people watching, this is the 14,500 square kilometer basin, where if water falls in here, it makes its way to lakes and the rivers that go down the Old Crow River drainage system and make its way to the Porcupine, which flows west to the Yukon River Basin. And this is Old Crow Flats. This is 5,600 square kilometers. Wherever you see lakes is flat landscape. And if you were to fly in a helicopter, it looks something like this. This was a shot that I took in 2009 on one of those early years. And it truly is an incredible place. And Chief Tizya-Tramm, you mentioned it's a refuge, and I think that's a really important word. And we can think of it as a refuge, going back to interglacial periods. There's reasons why animals of all different sorts were in this area and why people came here early. And I think that word refuge is important looking forward as well. And I think we're going to talk a little bit about that. So these lakes are typically thermokarst, and they're supported by permafrost. It's within the continuous permafrost zone. And this is the Old Crow River, and these sweeping meanders across the north end of the Old Crow River are just to put you in, you've probably been up and down here, Dana. This is just beyond a couple bends of Black Fox Creek as you make your way through. And you can see that the landscape, for everybody watching, around the river is perched well above it. And so if anything happens in the landscape, that information can be transferred into the water and into the drainage system. And so we can capture a lot of information from the rivers, so to speak. And you might recognize this camp, Dana. The Tetlichi is out at John Charlie Lake. And this is what Old Crow would look like. I'll leave that there for now. Now, getting back to partnerships and that whole theme of bringing together the science and the traditional knowledge, I know that you have a number of different thought bubbles. If we had to picture them all, mine has a giant one with landscape change and climate and Old Crow, and it occupies a massive part of my thinking. That is important with yours, I picture, but I imagine there's a number of different thought bubbles going on. But regardless, if we can just stay on this topic just for a little bit. You've mentioned in the past that it's important to fill the gaps between Indigenous ways of knowing and Western science best practices, as nature banks on diversity and rewards cooperation. That is a really eloquent and nice way to put things. Can you maybe speak to how we can build on this and push it forward more?
I'd love to. And I think an easy place to start is I myself, I love the sciences, philosophies and psychologies and geophysics and everything. And also, even down into physics and quantum physics and Planck's constant and the 14th decimal place. And the reason why I bring that up as an intro into traditional ways of knowing is that when we quantify things, when we draw lines on things, put labels on things, those distinctions are only useful to humans at a certain level. But the more you zoom in, the more you find that those borders really aren't there, in the sense that everything bleeds into one another. And as we know with atmospheric sciences, they connect to oceanographers, and it's all part of the same thing. So I think as the Western society and civilization was really born, and we had the mechanical philosophies of Descartes, Galileo, Newton, and these were really picked up in the Industrial Revolution and really launched to create an overlap, if you will, of early Western civilization's desire to understand things by compartmentalization and finding how they interact. But whereas is indigenous philosophies, we really saw an animal or a river as a representation of the invisible analogous relationships. So when we're looking to survival, we looked at the indicators, whether they be indicator species or changes in the environment, and we built these concepts of these webs of relationships. If there was a depression or even a swelling in one, we would look to how that really affects us because we were part of all of these things. So in that partnership, I actually see many connections and a very large vacuum in between the gap that lies between Western science and indigenous ways of knowing. They actually belong to one another and they complement one another. And for instance, if you ask a scientist what they would do or if they would value access to 30,000 years of data in the region, I mean, scientists would absolutely love that. It'd be a gold mine. Well, we have that, and they are our elders that are sitting right by the river. My grandmother knew areas where the woolly mammoth would be chased by our people into creeks to kind of limit their mobility so we could better hunt them, to giant sloths, different regions, and how those worked. So all of this to say is that our cultural disposition is not analogous or easily interpreted by the Western sciences, as it's mostly oral, all of the rest. But if you complement that and through the on the ground, front line, traditional harvesters and experts in their regions who have grown up under the guidance of their elders all the way back to time immemorial, our knowledge lives through generations and it only builds. So we actually, as an individual, if you're to go out with a hunter and you have a specialized scientist, we can very deftly point towards areas that scientists use as these indicators for regions and different matters that we quantify. So really what I'm trying to say is that one thing that we work on as our First Nation is that we try to put forward that perspective that modern day sciences actually legitimize, not necessarily legitimize, but they back up what our traditional knowledge already teaches us and what we already know. My elders, sitting down with them, they could speak about the hydrology of our areas for hours. They were professors in their own right because really, I mean, when it gets, I mean, it was just minus 50. Exactly. And so, I mean, just the other night, it was minus 52. So if you're outside without electricity, without any combustion engine or a steel knife, you have to be pretty ingenuitive to be able to strike a comfortable living. And what that really forced us to do through the heavy weight of survival, it created that keystone and that buttress of our relationships with each other and with the land. So this to say is that a big part of our survival came from the need of us making the universe into our university, opposed to going to a university to learn about the universe. But again, we are stronger together as almost two hemispheres of the same brain. And I really see on the horizon in the future this limbic system, if you will, that connects these conversations, these different data streams, because if you can just regurgitate information on a blank line at the right time and date, that's trivia. But if you can model it, that's intelligence. But when you connect it with your heart, then you have knowledge. So I see a lot of intelligence out there, but you can be very intelligent but not know much. And so I think with Indigenous peoples in Canada or around the world who are major advocates for their natural territories and areas, I hope this picture is developing that together we can have these large plumes and very articulate these nuances, but ground it into the regions and it kind of lateralize our combined effort. And that's really, I see the future, because I do have to stress that Western science, like, I'm not putting it down whatsoever. You know, for instance, the invention of the gun was extremely important for my people. We used rifles and it saved our people from starvation. The rifle is just a tool. The same thing with our sciences, our economies, our monetary systems. They're just tools. But how do we utilize those tools? If we give a gun to...
I think that's a great spot to go into. I think it really comes down to the platform at this point. We're getting so close to like lots of the different tools coming out and ways of looking at the landscape has been really helpful. And I think to truly complement the traditional knowledge and to put the tools in at the local level that filter down from the research requires an intuitive and accessible platform. And so, you know, for example, we're with drone surveys, we have a camera, we can take a stitched photo of the ground, we can track how something changes over time, but we also have things that our eyes can't see, like near infrared. That's information that tells us more about the landscape, but it requires the platform for it to be useful. You know, we can put stuff in reports that'll sit on a shelf, but maybe do you have thoughts on the platforms and bringing that level of technology to a place like a northern community like Old Crow?
Certainly so, and I have a favorite story about this. Just last year, pre-pandemic, I was in our local airport in our village, and there was an elder there by the name of James Itse, who's in his 70s and still goes out on the land and harvests wood. And he was in the airport, and I bumped into him on his wood trails. And I went over to James and I said, "Hey, James, look at this." And here I pull out my supercomputer, this amazing technology. And I accessed Google Earth and I zoomed into our community. And you can tell good firewood when the tops of trees dry out. And I zoomed into big swaths of forest and I said, "Look at all that good wood there." And I was actually identifying good dry wood for our fireplaces through Google satellite, through satellites in space. I mean, and you know, my grandfather was still working on bedside fallow caribou fences, corralling them around Black Fox Creek, that area that you had showed. And now his grandson has a supercomputer in his pocket where I can find dry wood from space. So these gaps, although we were left behind in this technological revolution, that's actually a benefit to all of us, because we have a better chance of getting in front of these tools. And so just quickly, in one of the platforms you spoke of, we know our traditional areas and how they were utilized for thousands of years. So the changes that we're seeing now with the warming in our area being over 2 times the average of the globe, we're seeing these changes happening very quickly, and we can see the domino effects. And I've heard elders who have no formal education discuss things that I'm now seeing in reports around bird studies, mercury levels, all these different areas. So one example would be if we could arm our on-the-ground harvesters with certain observational data collection that could feed into a real-time system for meteorologists, hydrologists, you know, earth sciences. I mean, these are really great indicators for international or even Canadian government to be getting this data, but also if it could feed back to issuing reports to our community on predictions over time. I mean, you see it today with even the CSA issuing engineering considerations for the changing climate with buildings in the Arctic over the next 60 years. So you can see how we need establishing these self-feedback loop processes with our traditional harvesters, our on the lands, and our elders can really benefit science, save them a lot of time, get them to direct indicator species or areas and habitats, and everybody benefits from this relationship.
Absolutely, especially in a year like this. And as I mentioned, the partnerships are absolutely important. We were, like I said earlier, Parks Canada and Vuntut National Park in particular has really pushed the legacy of one of our IPY projects forward, and that's monitoring the hydrology of lakes, just taking water samples from 14 lakes a couple times a year at least. And I mean, helicopters were grounded and it was difficult for people to get out, but what you're speaking of is the next level that we need to get to. I've had great experiences out on the land with various elders that have, they've really opened my eyes. It's been special on a personal level, and I'll get to that eventually. But on the research side, those observations are absolutely important. When James Linklater lights up and he's like, I have not seen a slump like this. This is, and you could see his mind being blown a little bit, and it's like registers, yeah, this is important. This is, let's survey this now. But then on the other end, on the youth side of it, we were lucky to have Caleb Charlie. We talked him into coming out with us. It didn't take much. He really enjoyed himself out with us in early 2019, and he was drawn in by the technology. He enjoyed being out on the land, but he loved throwing that drone around, and he was fascinated with it. I know he's got a photography side and an artistic side, and I think that this edition was just another piece of the puzzle that opened his eyes, and I really look forward to exploring that a little bit more with younger people around the community, and I'd certainly like to help out, put equipment and expertise where I can into those hands. So you're absolutely right. Like, we're grounded. I didn't go there at all this year, and I'm supported by NSERC to go up with students and continue these projects, but we need to get creative, and the information and approaches needs to change hands to some respect, or at least really come together effectively. You also mentioned days going way back where your grandmother would explain wildlife dynamics, that sort of thing. And if I just start this by saying, a colleague and friend of mine, Dr. Michael Fletcher down in Melbourne, Australia, his research focus is utilizing lake sediment to understand the timing of past burns, and he and his team has picked out the timing of when the landscape was actively managed by the Aboriginal communities in that area. And on that theme, this is, it's out of my realm. I'm not a wildlife biologist by any means, but have the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation and Gwitchin community as a whole done any level of management that could be detectable over time? Or can you speak to how that might have worked?
Certainly so. What's really interesting, first of all, is that us being here since the time when beavers were 9 feet tall, our oral history does remember, and our youth today know the story of when we first came here so long ago. And then people should look up on Wikipedia, if you'd like, Bluefish Caves. And it's an area just outside of our village with an ungulate's jawbone with obvious human striations and tooling that carbon dates to about 24,000 years ago. So that's just a little bit of, some of that scientific evidence to back up our position here. So we've been working with the animals for a very long time. And one key piece of Indigenous technology is raising the forests. And so a big part of the Indigenous disposition is we are not above or below any other animal. I love the way my sister put it. You know, when you go out on the land doesn't care if you're a muskrat, a moose, or a man. All of your lessons are the same, and really, you work together. So we didn't really necessarily dominate animals or the land, but worked with it and fomented those natural technologies. And we looked at those invisible relationships, and we capitalized on scraping off the fat, if you will, in these relationships. For instance, we would move into areas. I'll use one example with marten, or this is analogous to any animal, but with marten, we know that when they become overpopulated, the males begin fighting with one another and they tear each other up. But if we move into these areas and we trap them, we take out those extra populations, and it's healthier for the animals, and then we continue to move on. So this is the way in which we struck this balance with our natural world. And today, moving through our country, you won't really see our presence. You might find arrowheads or some graves, but that's really it. So we've been in this area for tens of thousands of years, and the area is still thriving. So another example, for instance, is burning down forests. And I appreciate you bringing up the lake sediment levels as well. As Charles C. Mann writes in his book, 1491, I believe, we found through studies in lake sediments, the carbon emissions from forest fires. And actually, when Europeans came and the many diseases that wiped out 90% of American populations, we stopped burning the forests. And that's how the mini ice age occurred in Europe, because of this lack of carbon being emitted into the air. So that again shows our relationships, we're all intertwined. But really what that does is in overgrowth areas, you have less animals, there's less feeding areas. So actually by burning a forest, you promote a lot of the shoots and the shrubs, and the rodents come, and then the mosses, the lichens, and the willows come, and then the hares come, and then the predators come to hunt them. And so it's this whole life cycle. And this was really utilized. Another example that I use is the city of Tinochin on Lake Titicaca, the Triple Alliance, the key of the Triple Alliance in the Aztecan Empire. This city occurred on a lake, and in 1491, was the most highly populated, architecturally sophisticated, and just most beautiful city in the world. And today, you can't really see the human footprint. And you contrast that with New York City and all of the foods, nutrients, everything going into the city, it's producing a lot of waste. And the habitat around it can't sustain it. And really, that's born from this non-localized presence or world disposition. So in our communities, we even went to great feats in building huge caribou fences, which today their populations are about 220,000 strong. But we actually used to chase them into these major fences made out of wood. And we would harvest the meat from those as well, which really helped our populations boom. When it was actually the caribou that taught us how to make those fences and where to corral them. There's just an endless amount of examples like that in how we struck these really sustainable niches in this environment. And really, if we can do it up here in the Arctic, this can be established in easily really nutritionally rich environments, such as along the coasts. But New York, that area, and Manhattan, the indigenous peoples there had practiced it as well. And I just wanted to drive home that one other point is we have to remember that the tools utilized by New York City or modern day aren't inherently imbalanced. It's just how they're used creates imbalance. And I think that's where we're talking about here, where indigenous values could help city planners and the rest kind of strike that balance of a more environmental consciousness And just to close off, I think a really great study was done by city planners in Tokyo, Japan, where they had a fungus, and they dropped nutrient points on a map and let the fungus grow. And it actually redesigned some of their infrastructure far more efficiently than city engineers did. And it was a mushroom, basically. So it's really incredible how we can overlap these and benefit from this symbiosis relationship, because really nature, in indigenous ways of expressing it in Western language and values, is that to indigenous people, nature is the most efficient and advanced technology that exists. That's why we look at nature as our teacher, because even today, nothing that man has created is as advanced or sustainable as what nature does effortlessly.
So obviously in contrast to a place like New York that you speak of, Old Crow has, obviously there's links to tradition and ways of living off the land and being sustainable. But again, you mentioned the timing of when electricity came in. The village requires a diesel generator to function, and obviously there's the Vuntut Gwitchin have a flair for innovation. Is that, I know that you have the solar farm on the books and it's actually ready to go. Do you see this as, can you describe how that's a way forward to get back to, or I guess combine the best of both worlds, tradition and innovation, to get back to this sustainable situation that you're referring to in some ways?
I have to try to stay humble here, but I am really proud of this. And this came from the direction of our youth. More powerful than any politician or any army is an idea that's time has come. And we've been able to take advanced technologies and relax them into traditional principles, realized through a photovoltaic system of over 2,000 bifacial solar panels in our community of 250 people. This solar panel project, which delivers electricity through a microgrid system. Moreover, what I can say, and more powerful than my words, is when photons will be converted into electrons and delivered in a microgrid system in our community, saving over 145,000 liters of diesel a year, as diesel is currently flown into our community and burned in a generator that began in about 1973. But more important, and what's really more nuanced in this relationship, is our community and our government. We negotiated the first independent power producer document and electricity purchase agreement in the Yukon, and this will be a template that will be released across the country of Canada. And what we did with these documents is the local utility, ATCO Electric, is whom we went into these negotiations with. Now, they sell us electricity at about somewhere around 73 cents per kilowatt hour, some of the highest in the country. Now, we're selling them renewable energy at just over 60 cents. So we're actually saving ATCO shareholders money. They don't have to fly as much diesel. They don't have to maintain and operate the diesel generator as much, as it will now be shut off on sunny days from early March to late September. And the community will go quiet for the first time since 1973. So what we're doing now is, because of the savings that we are now selling to ATCO shareholders, they're making money off of this. We have now unlocked over $250,000 per year. Now, remember that energy, money is a type of energy as well. So we've now localized this fiscal energy that was being exported to ATCO shareholders, is now anchored in our community, where we're now reinvesting those monies to satisfy one of our directions, a government resolution to be carbon neutral by 2030. So our community of 250 people now has access to over $250,000 per year that is going right back into the community, creating jobs, all of the rest. So we've managed to leverage this solar panel farm into a socioeconomic driver as well, driving even more jobs, economies, and really getting us towards that self-sustainability. And you know what? There are berry patches right along the solar panels. So our elders are going to be picking berries right by advanced technology. And really, they're utilizing the same principles. But if I just could quickly extrapolate that towards the caribou issue, and I'm not sure if the listeners are aware of what had taken place in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in these caribou calving grounds. But as that in our advocacy as Gwitchin to protect these lands, a big part of my advocacy and in bridging Indigenous ways of knowing with Western best practices, I really tell people, look, if you're going to drill in these calving grounds for maybe 10 years of oil, what you're going to be doing is destabilizing a renewable energy system, as these caribou have been in this area for over 2 million years. And the caribou are anchoring nutrients that are formed through the chloroplasts in the flora of that area through cotton grasses and lichen, and they're turning sunlight into nutrients. The caribou eat this and they wash like an ebb and flow across our nation, feeding wolves, moose, scavengers, predators, and that's what allowed our people to live here as well. So we need to kind of expand our value systems in economies. And another important issue to balance this is that I have not met Indigenous peoples who are against development. We're for sustainable development. And I think this is also an important maxim when we discuss things and we make decisions. It is always considering many generations in the past and many generations in the future. So when we talk about countries on the cutting edge of sciences, in our huge tower of technology, I have not heard of strategic plans coming from any country that go 300 years into the future, when that is the natural place that Indigenous people speak from. And all of this goes back again, and to your point of partnership, that idea is the very reason why I'm here today. My great grandmother, Catherine Natru, she married a third generation Scotsman who came up here with the Hudson Bay Company. And she married him and she said, in the future, we're going to need his knowledge to survive. And I want my grandchildren to go out into the world and then bring the world back to our community. So my great grandmother knew this, and my grandmother, her whole life was about providing education for her people. And now here I am today, being able to have this conversation with a foot in the modern world and a foot in the traditional world. So really, I am an embodiment of the vision of my grandmother, who saw the importance of these partnerships. And it's really a part of myself and the fabric of my being to honor that and to really bring us together and hopefully create more cycles that bring us even closer together. And not only these partnerships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples, but more importantly, the marriage and the conversation between our values and our ideas as well.
Right. So speaking about the caribou, so if the system and the structure of Old Crow and moving forward includes lots of innovations and things that you can control. You can accumulate the resources that are necessary to build the capacity for that and inject some of that into the community. What about the things that can't be controlled? Were you must have been relieved, at least temporarily, when President Joe Biden just recently signed that executive order for a temporary moratorium on the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. There's also the salmon fisheries. There's things that are out of your hands, and and I know that that Vuntut Gwitchin have spent a great deal of time lobbying in the States for decades. Your uncle, the late Chief Joe Linklater, was involved in a lot of that. And there's a lot of people around the community that were involved in that. That has got to be taxing and take a lot of resources. And did this executive order provide some temporary relief? Where does it go from here? I just
Certainly so. Yeah, and I want to be extra careful to be especially respectful around such a contentious issue that the whole world is bearing witness to. But I think that reiterates and really reaffirms where I'm coming from, because I understand the need for hydrocarbons, but I also understand what the IPCC and my elders speak of is where we're going in the future. But I think really to drive it home is beneath the lands of the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and Ijikwatsan-Gwandai-Kutlit, or as Anilka refers to, the 1002 lands, below the surface is more than just oil. Below that surface is the future of my people. Below that surface is the ability for my grandchild to continue to eat caribou as his people have done since time immemorial. So really, where are our value systems in economies, in socioeconomics, in all of the rest? So the executive order by Joe Biden is actually nothing really controversial. It's actually, calling it out that the emperor has no clothes. And we came closer than we ever have in our history to having these areas developed. And if I may be so bold, I'd like to say that, first of all, there's this maxim that I operate by in understanding before I approach or speak to anybody, is that really we have to understand that there are three types of truth. There's your personal truth, a political truth, and an objective truth. And this area, so intimate to us as Gwitchin, is a mirror that if we look into it, we can see ourselves as human beings reflected in it. Because my people don't have an arbitrary commitment to it. This is quite literally a part of our lives and our future. Because if you get rid of this caribou species, are you going to fly us up foods that cause diabetes, and then we're going to start becoming taxing on healthcare systems? It's also a security issue. We saw with COVID, major interruptions in our supply lines. It's already this incredible balance that it's perfectly there, and all you have to do is leave it alone. And so, how shall we prioritize some of these key areas? And this is something that my people have done from time immemorial, and is actually realized in the very nature of our modern day treaties, which with the Canadian government, we've become a self-governing First Nation. And I remember going back to when you were talking about the slumps in the rivers. When we were striking out the category A lands, and I won't get too technical, but it's surface and subsurface rights really, our elders told us, you must protect the watersheds and the key areas. They said even the bugs need that water. And what we're finding now through studies is that when these slumps occur, they occlude the water systems, choking out fish and bug populations, which are fundamental to whole ecology. So they really reverberate out in really detrimental effects. So we are as very porous in the sense that we are so sensitive to our areas. We're really able to designate which areas could sustain some development, as we have focused on in our over 54,000 kilometers of traditional territory. But we've also identified some key areas that just can't be touched. And the Old Crow Flats is one of them. And there is oil in the Old Crow Flats. But as our elders said, that is your bank. And, we have major international investments. As a government, we're invested in China, in technologies all over. But that key area of the Crow Flats, no matter what may come, If electricity were to stop one day, if planes stop coming to our community, we have the Crow Flats, which is a wellspring of life in what to outsiders would look like just an area that you simply cannot live. These areas generate life. And just to close that point off, I was going up the river with an elder, the late Georgie Moses, one day. And as we were passing this creek, he turned over and just motioned. And I looked, and there was a young moose in that creek, about 3 years old. And then when we got down to his camp, we made some tea and had a cigarette. And he spoke to me and he said, you remember that moose we saw in that creek? And I told him, yeah, I remember that. And he said, that moose has been standing there my whole life. Now, at the time, Georgie was in his late 60s. And that comment confused me. I thought, that moose was 3 years old. What does he mean? It's been there his whole life. And as our elders usually do, they'll say one sentence and you spend years unpacking it and finding all of this teachings in it. And I realized what he meant. That moose, that area promotes moose, and his grandfather taught him of that area. And now he knows that area, and his grandchildren know that area, and they know that they can sustainably harvest moose in that area. And that's contrasted with very informed development, because what if we were to develop that creek for oil? Well, we're going to lose that moose forever. So it's not about just saying no, absolutely to development. What it is about is balancing our needs as a species, our fundamental needs as human beings in this balance with our environment, as well as balancing the advanced tools and technology we have today, both of them in respect of our future generations, striking the balance as the Paris Accord and the International Panel on Climate Change are now waking the modern life up to.
Yeah. I'm stuck on the image of Georgie Moses. I spent a lot of time with him and going over to his and Mary Jane's house for tea and going to their cabin, and he was a special person. He had that effect on people, and I really appreciated it. And yeah, it was quite sad when he passed. Those are one of those things, from a researcher's perspective, you've got all these objectives, A, B, C, and D, go get those and life is wonderful. But there's so much, and there are some intriguing results that are coming out of this that I'm quite proud of, and it's really contributing to the global knowledge of how these systems are changing. But there's something that's very profound that this research has just introduced to me, and it's just with the people out on the land and in Old Crow. It's in addition to how much carbon is in a pile of mud, or how a lake changes over time, the experience has indeed enriched the soul, so to speak, and offered insight and perspective that I would otherwise not have. And for that, I'll be eternally grateful for being welcomed into this world. And so you got my partnership. Absolutely. On that, we're making Old Crow Flats sound almost like this fairy tale that you described to the CBC when you had some visitors earlier in the year during the pandemic. It's one thing that needs to be underscored here, in that you mentioned it. It's the need for survival and the resources. And people, when I went out there, I was a naive younger person, and I thought you just need to be tough or just naturally capable of dealing with severe environments. But it's not, you need to be smart. And that's really what's getting across here. You need to be able to understand how to work with the landscape. And it does sound like a wonderful place. If people listening are like, wow, I wish I was going to be out there like now. And what do you offer? I mean, there's lots of great things, down the road with the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation and moving forward, and there's resources. What can we offer in terms of, as you know, in addition to your dance with Gurdeep Pander, for positivity to other places? You know, the people in New York that are up 40 stories stuck in somewhere that doesn't have this. Like, what do you, this model isn't possible for everybody, as we know.
Mhm. I would say that, you know, and I want to be careful about this statement because it's not really what prophecy. I mean, it's not really, it's really deep, but our elders let us know, and they've always warned us that hard times are coming. And it's not like they put a date and a time to it. And it's actually really intelligent and wise to live your life like that. You know, it's like stocks and investments. You're not just investing for, you know, the best time and like when your stocks are gonna, you really should come from the what the pitfalls could be. And if we always live that, our lives from, you know, really mitigating the hard times, then it allows us to be prepared for when those come. And in saying that, I've really come to understand from traveling the world, going through Europe, South America, Asia, all over the place. I really have come to understand that my people are holding on to ancient truths, and we have remembered a lot of the teachings that this world could benefit from, and it's going to happen. And the important part is that our elders have always told us, in the future, those people in the South are going to need us. They're going to come to us at some point, and they said, you have to help them. You have to be there for them. And I mean, it's just such a beautiful place to come from. Our elders had always instilled in us. But that being said, I very much enjoy the almost guerrilla warfare approach to established economics and paradigms. Our people don't necessarily take those for the institutions that they are. We like to take them apart and rebuild them into how they can serve our community in a self-determined and self-sustainable way. Our village does not want to become New York City. We want to continue to be out on the land. Like, those where really our priorities are. And so with the disruptive business modeling that our solar panels exhibit, this is just the beginning. We're looking into innovations in how to establish a bush economy in our community, straddling professionals that can navigate corporate acts and financing and reporting to really unlock our renewable lifestyles on the land in a sustaining way in our community, empowering our people fiscally, but also to benefit fiscally from living sustainably with the land. And what's really important about this is that I quite boldly tell people, if you want to see the future of Canada, don't just look to Vancouver or to Toronto, look to the Indigenous communities, because that's where we are really taking modern technologies, modern ideas, and playing jazz with them, if you will, to ascertain new balances and new forms. And we know we need this from the IPCC. And again, the economies and technology is not responsible for climate change. It is how we've applied them. So really, it's not a technological problem, and not even really a carbon emissions problem. It's a narrative problem. We approached our planet with an imbalanced mind or worldview. When our worldview becomes balanced, it's just a matter of time before the world achieves balance again. And so a lot of those innovations in economies, in social structures, and applications of technology are being done right across the Indigenous communities in Canada and around the world that have been left behind in the industrialization and technological revolutions, which really allows us to be birthing grounds of innovations. And this takes off a lot of capacity off of academia, scientific institutions, federal institutions, where, you know, you could pour a lot of money into issues, or, you know, you could empower our Indigenous villages and just step back and watch what we come up with. And I really challenge people because, you know, I've read books going all the way back to, you know, The Wealth of Nations from Adam Smith. And, you know, I understand these concepts, but what I challenge is, why cannot major economic paradigm shifts or concepts be born in my village of 250 people? You know, even things like creating peripheral economic values for to balance out our current economic consumptions for raw materials. Like, what is the economic value of 1 pound of salmon, for instance, because we know our salmon populations are dropping. Well, we know that diabetes are raising in Indigenous populations whose evolution of digestion systems have been behind because of the exposure of Westerners to their modern diets as well. But we know there's big movements towards natural foods, towards having less hands in the turnover in foods from, you know, the ground to the person's mouth. We know that the agricultural industry can really benefit from some of these practices with the heavy use of pesticides, where you could change over to crop turning and more diversity in the plants that have natural, like, I mean, a lot of these complexities are leveraged, and the fulcrum are the simple principles. And these are practices that are still happening in my village. So we are really innovating these, and much of my career has actually been made on lining up mandates and commitments from of forward-thinking governments, whether that be federal under the Trudeau government or local under the Yukon territorial government, both of which have declared climate change emergencies. And we sync up these mandates right across the country. And with the electricity purchase agreement and the independent power producing document, this is something that my government paid for, not Canadian taxpayer dollars. Our employees did this, and the entire country is going to benefit from it. And that's not the only case. So we have these major, huge boulders up a hill full of kinetic energy that we're just wanting to give to the rest of the world, and people can access these documents for free. And we've done a lot of this work with Canada as well on the Arctic Council, as Gwitchin Council International is a permanent participant of. And in our partnership with Canada, we created the Arctic Energy Toolkit, which is an over 200-page document in how to bring a community through consultation processes to arrive to renewable energy products. The list really goes on, and there's a lot of good news. And this is being done with a village that only got electricity in 1973.
Thanks for that. I've got so many things that I can get into, but we're coming to the time where I need to get into some of the questions that are being filtered down from the Q&A from the people who are watching. And if you'll just bear with me, this is where I wish I had a little bit of music for everybody. Okay, I think we've covered some of these. So here's one. With regard to this is from Erica Dingman. With regard to the benefits of Indigenous values to city planners, have you had experience with cities or given thought as to how those relationships could be developed? Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that. I actually spent a number of years, about 6 years, in Vancouver City, which is quite a densely populated city. And I think this is where it's really important to start establishing these. And I remember actually in a past talk I had with, thankfully, and this is from Nadine Fabi, allowing me to speak in Seattle, Washington, when I was there pre-pandemic. I had pretty much the same question. And first of all, I want to say that the knowledge that Indigenous people hold, although we have cultural systems and we know about appropriation, et cetera, but the ideas don't belong to us. They are all of our grandchildren's birthright. And really anyone can practice. And what it is really about is establishing relationships with your environment directly around you. And this comes very importantly for city engineers. I mean, I remember my grandmother, Indigenous bushwoman, saying in the late 90s, the cities are covered in pavement. How is the soils going to, how are the waters when it rains get to the soils? And I thought to myself, oh, Grandma, what do you know about, they have city engineers with degrees. Well, lo and behold, CBC right across the country is talking about issues with the soils under cities now because they're not getting saturated in the waters, which they're naturally inclined to. So the big part is this. And it's really important to get out into empty spaces, into natural spaces. And what I call it is the language before words. See, all the animals and nature, everything is speaking to you. It's just not doing it in English. And by eliminating yourself, working very hard to get your ego out of there, and being receptive and open, and the more time you spend allows you this natural sponging and looking at these relationships. And it takes a time, but they have many teachings for us, even, the squirrel in our traditional territory. I've had benefit only from being out on the land, where I've now realized, and it's actually happened, where a raven and a squirrel literally came to me and warned me about an approaching bear. And I'll never forget their calls and their sounds now. So it's really, and this is what's difficult in cities, because when you are disconnected from your family history, from your story, then a different context can utilize you differently. And this is really the important part of what I've been saying about modern technology. Look, it's one thing to have a wicked intelligence. I'm inventing words here, but it's how that intelligence, the context of that intelligence can make it a poison or a medicine. So really, by natural spaces and connecting with these spaces come natural teachings and natural realizations, which is very, very important, because it was the land that taught my people how to live on it. So in cities, when we remove ourselves from the land, when we remove ourselves from animals, I mean, we don't eat cow, we buy beef. We don't eat pigs, we buy pork from a store. So as many opportunities as we can, especially with children, getting them out into these natural spaces, and in your own way, creating those connections is really important. And sorry to speak a little bit long on this, but I even now find this through science. As we know, through the way that gases diffuse, we can chart, through one exhalation, the amount of argon. We can actually calculate how long it will take to dissipate in a room, as well as on the planet. And we have to remember that oxygen has never left Earth, and new oxygen hasn't come to Earth. It's recycled. Literally, the world is breathing with us, and you're breathing the air of your ancestors as well. And we don't, even through microscopes and electroscopes, we can't tell where air ends and a human begins. So it's finding these connections, and you can find it through science and through the natural spaces as well. And that's what I think is really important, that we balance these forms and systems of knowledge, and especially around contexts.
The point on oxygen really runs True. It is actually the way that we track how lakes are responding to climate is we're simply following oxygen around and seeing where it goes from place to place throughout the landscape. And we can evaluate what lakes are more vulnerable to drying or getting more flow from snow or rain, that kind of thing. But just bringing it out onto the landscape. I have another different question here from Derek Parker. To Dana and Kevin, have you traveled to other northern or southern remote communities and reflected on common or divergent perspectives, be they social, economic, or environmental? So if you ever,
Oh, yes.
I'm thinking divergent. So if you come to a meeting and wait, there's a roadblock with all these ideas, what's your experience been?
Well, first of all, I would just like to say is Indigenous peoples, I have never met another Indigenous person or community that really denies climate change. Like that's really the foundation of our conversations. And there's a lot of these pathways, but just quickly, I remember going to COP25 and I met an Indigenous youth there from Brazil. And we began to talk and right away we call each other brother. And I told him about one of our people's oral histories that tens of thousands of years ago, a group left our people to go follow the sun and go see where the sun went. And so they went down south. And a couple of decades ago, we found a community of people in Ecuador that called themselves the people of the sun. And it was interesting because even down in Brazil, he was saying that his people have an oral tradition that they came from the north and they came to this area. So here we are sitting down with each other and through our oral histories, reaching each other as we used to be one people tens of thousands of years later. I mean, the power of oral histories and the great tendrils of our people reaching out like the roots of a tree and connecting us. And that amazing synergy right there, that heart connection was amazing. But yes, I have experienced both of them. And really the main crux of where these ideas diverge is the socioeconomic conditions. Like with the Mikisew Cree down where the tar sands are in Canada, a lot of their traditional territory, you can't hunt on it anymore. So they actually survive on economics. They don't really have a choice. And they have a very difficult time because many Indigenous peoples across Canada are really about, saving some of our key and special areas and, UNESCO designations and parks and all of these different layers. But they need, their only avenue left is through development and really through economics. But even on, although their land basis, they cannot access it in that way anymore. Even through the economics, there are still ways that we can find these synergies because at the end of the day, we don't necessarily want to grow for growth's sake. It's about self-sustainability and self-determination, which are those two keys. So, but I would liken that even further, and if I may, I'd like to share with the group here that, when we had first, our people, the Vuntut Gwitchin, we still remember when we had first met the first white man. It's a story we call Grass Pants. And anyways, our first word for our non-Indigenous white brother was Chukje Gwitchin. Now you see, I'm Vuntut Gwitchin, which means I am the people of the many lakes. To the east of us are the Tetlejay Gwitchin, the people of the headwaters. To the west of us are the Gwitchajay Gwitchin, the people of the high plains. Chukje Gwitchin meant the people who live under stone, because they were building houses of stone and brick houses. So actually all these, everyone here today, you're Gwitchin as well. It's just what area are you from? And you see, we defined ourselves by our land and by our regions. So really, how do we define ourselves and how do we contextualize our story, our knowledge basis in which we build our intellect from? And that's really important. And I believe that by contextualizing ourselves, either by our self-determination, which is, our jurisdictions, our sovereignty, as well as our self-sustainability, which I think is the really big international conversation happening now, but also from our rooted lands and our regions. And as well as our partner, Tshakshé Gwitchin, I can also tell you, and I don't speak on behalf of Indigenous peoples across Canada, of course, but in my region and in my lands, my elders would have welcomed anyone. We work together even in our dog teams. Like, there's no mush where we sit behind and, just crack a whip. No, we have the harnesses over our shoulders and we're polling with the dog teams as well. Anyone who wanted to live with us in respect and partnership, we would have welcomed with open arms. So really the future is, how are we going to strike that balance? And I would say that the Indigenous peoples are really waiting to really share those lessons and find those communication points to take those divergence and actually make them convergence, because they really are there. And, even with the caribou issue in that advocacy, when we have someone in the oil and gas industry saying that, oh, you're an environmentalist. Well, that label is kind of convenient because it goes deeper than that. And our advocacy for the caribou is for all of our grandchildren, not just Gwitchin, but for all of our futures. And it's so important to take a look at these seemingly contentious issues and reflecting on it, not from our vocation, but from our disposition as a species.
Right. Now, we've really drawn out some details coming from your part of the world, your traditional territory. To amplify and to really push it forward with positive steps forward, what is needed at the local level to get to build that capability of forging ahead for some of the things that we've talked about? If there's return on investment, how would that be invested within the community, and how do you build on that capacity, especially, and it's always been my experience that the Vuntut Gwitchin First Nation and Old Crow set such a strong example for pushing forward into the future. And like when I was welcomed into the community, just like you said, it was welcoming, and we had a workshop and we went over different research priorities, and there was that team, but we need that team to actually see some of this through to fruition. When you have such major issues like intergenerational disruptions, stemming from residential schools and all the past issues, playing it part of this equation, what is it that's needed to build in? You said in the past, we need the opposite of residential schools. What does that look like to make the wheels turn and go the way that people can agree on?
I really appreciate this question, and I think it hits on the heart of the deepest contemplations born in my own experiences and what I see across modern day civilization and organizational systems in our society. And what I tell people is, look, our greatest resource as a self-governing First Nation, as my government and the spokesperson for my government, our greatest resource is our youth. It's not our international investments. It's not our return rates. It's our youth. And, our elders, I remember one of our elders was telling a story to her grandchildren, and I was really jarred by how she ended it. She said, my babies, I am so glad that we had this time to speak today, and I could tell you these stories, because now that you know these stories, our ancestors can live through you. So when I talk about disruptive business models, for instance, we are now in the beginning stages of operationalizing our inherent right to our education systems. So what we'll be doing in our community is we are going to be taking over the money systems for our education and deliver it by our government for our people. And what we've already have programs called culture camps where the youth go out on the land for a month and we learn biology through muskrats, all of this. So what we're going to be looking to designing is a 4 semi-permanent encampments around our traditional territory. And every season, the children will be taking school in different areas of our land. And so really what I'm trying to say here is, for instance, we could look at it this way. When we talk, yeah, well, for instance, we don't have to overcook the loaf of bread here. I mean, when we talk about cultural revitalization and bringing back Indigenous languages which are endangered, look, we don't need to design heavy curriculums and incredible amounts of funding. Our language did not come from a book under fluorescent lights in 4 walls. It came from out on the land. All we need to do is get our youth out onto the land with our elders and leave them alone, and it's going to naturally occur. And the major efficiencies that are going to be happening there as well. So there are incredible efficiencies that we could make in our schooling systems. For instance, if, I know there's a program in Alberta where half the school day, the children actually run a small society for half the day. And then the next half goes into academia. And studies are showing that these children are doing better in high school, not necessarily because of having a better education, but they understand what their place is in society and they apply themselves more to high school. Because I know I heard it all the time. Kids were saying, like, what am I going to do with trigonometry? What am I going to use that for? Well, when that context and that knowledge and that investment in our youth, what I'm trying to say at the end of the day is I really bank on the natural ingenuity in human beings. And when we look at climate change, it's much like getting a terminal diagnosis by your doctor. First you're going to be in shock and you're not going to accept it. And you're going to move through the stages of grief, anger, bartering, all of this until it comes to acceptance. When it comes to the climate change issue, an objective truth, we need to get through those stages of anger, not accepting it. And we need to get to acceptance and come from a positive space, because the world is telling us something and it's mirroring the imbalances, not of the planet itself, but of ourselves. The climate change is telling us more about us as individuals and where our values are than anything else. And if we can empower our youth, like we're doing in our community, we're not trying to dictate what the future looks like. We're investing into them because they're going to inherit our systems. They're the ones who we're banking on are going to double down on the ingenuity and establish a new normal. And this is, I think, one of the greatest, has the greatest proclivity towards anxieties for Indigenous peoples. A lot of people are saying, like, where's our traditions? We're losing our traditions. And I say, we haven't lost anything. As long as we have our land, that's what taught us our caribou dances. That's what taught us our social systems, our cohesion systems, and it's still there. And our land is still there and it's waiting and holding on to all the lessons that we need to amass as a people. We haven't lost anything. Our only decision is, are we going to subscribe to the large shadow that we find ourselves in the monumental challenge, or as a natural principle, are we going to follow nature and bank on diversity and reward that cooperation?
That is, like I said before, I do like that that last sentence. And I've always been drawn in by the people of the community telling stories and communicating insight, whether it's during tea or at a baseball game, playing floor hockey, around in a big gym. I was involved in a community meeting. We're all in a circle, and I was just absolutely floored by just the profound things that were coming out of, like, Brandon Kikovichik. He got up and just said the most engaging story and a reflection of his own personal views, and it had an impact on the community. And he was a youth. at that time. This is over a decade ago. And then you have people like Stephen Frost getting up and I've always been really drawn into this. And there's obviously a good reason why Vuntut Gwitchin have amassed such a rich bank of orally communicated traditional knowledge. And I would just like to say that your contributions here today have certainly demonstrated that talent. And thanks very much for that. Perhaps there were some questions that were quite related, and I believe that we covered them in ways throughout there. But maybe if we've covered many topics, we've been all over the place as we normally do, and they're all interrelated at the core. Can you finish us off with just a story, an example to illustrate the concept, perhaps, and then we're through.
I'd absolutely love to. And I think this is a perfect story to bridge exactly how we began with what academia is calling bridging Indigenous ways of knowing with scientific and Western best practices, and reestablishing this new normal and the ingenuity in generations. And as the Greeks refer to children as tabula rasa in Latin, which translates to a blank slate. What are we writing on them? There's one story that comes to mind that I think ties everything together nicely. My niece at the time, Eleanor, she was about 4 years old, and I would take her out on our little uncle trips, and we'd go out the front door and I'd pick her up and we'd go walking to the tree line, which was just 20 feet from our house. And I'd set her down right at that tree line, just thick with willow. And I'd tell her, okay, baby, show uncle where to go. Because I just wanted her to grow up, not just following or relying on adults, but showing us the way. And so she would attack that brush and enter it. And, often I would have to get down on all fours and follow her. And I'll never forget one beautiful sunny day in the summer, we came to this break in the canopy and the trees, and she stopped. And she looked at this thorn bush across this tiny little clearing of probably 30 feet. And there was a thorn bush opposite to us with this gorgeous pink flower blooming. And she stopped at 4 years old and looked at it and she said, "Wow, uncle, look at that flower. It's beautiful." And in that moment, I recognized that her heart and her mind were just open. And so I picked her up and I walked her over to that flower. And I said, "Baby, I would like to introduce you to your grandmother." And she looked at me and furrowed her brow and she said, "No, uncle, it's not." And I said, "Yes, baby, this is your grandmother." And I brought her close to the flower and showed her the leaf and the veins that were reaching out through the petal. And I asked her, "Can you see those veins?" And she looked at them and she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Now look at your hand. Can you see the veins in your hand?" And she looked at her hand and she looked at me complexed and she said, "Yeah, I can." And I said, "Baby, your grandmother has been working very hard for a long time so that she could meet you and that she could see herself through your eyes." And I told her, "Look around at the forest." I said, "These are all your grandfathers." And the moment I said that, this gust of wind came and all the trees began to dance and all of their leaves began to rattle in a cacophony of tiny applause. And in that moment, I could see in her little mind the reverence that she was attaching to these plants and creating a relationship. And in the simple principle, she began understanding evolution and our attachment and our responsibility to one another. And it's still something she carries with her today. And in that moment, she was able to encapsulate not just intelligence, but creating knowledge. And as one of our greatest technologies as human beings is developing that relationship and harboring a more wholesome form of knowing. And to be able to share that story with everyone here today, for your facilitation, Dr. Turner, as well as my fellow Shitjas, Nadine, Fabi, as well as Council General Brandon Lee and everyone listening today. It's really an honor. And again, this voice is not mine. These ideas and truths are not mine. My voice has traveled for a long time to reach your ears today. And if anything that we've spoke about resonates as truth, it is not mine to give, but was always your birthright. And like a salmon fighting up the river to spawn in a gravel bed, truth has always been fighting against the entropy of the universe to spawn in the beds of our hearts and our minds. So, Masi Cho, thank you very much, everyone.
Masi Cho, Chief Dana Tizya-Tramm, and I'm sure all of us, just like yourself with Georgie and Eleanor with your story, we're all going to be unpacking this for quite a while. So with that, I'll send this over to Ryan for some closing remarks.
Thank you. What an amazing conversation. Chief Dana, thank you so much for sharing your insights, your perspectives. In addition to working at the World Affairs Council, I'm also a high school teacher, and just listening to your stories reminded me of the role that I play as an educator and hopefully the impact I'm having on my students. Kevin, thank you so much for moderating this conversation. I think everyone learned an awful lot. Thanks to the audience for their great questions. We hope that you'll consider, if you're a K-12 educator or if you're in a community college role, that perhaps you'll decide to join us for our Arctic series, which is coming up on the 25th of February. We have 5 wonderful programs. And I think this keynote with Chief Dana was the perfect way to begin this journey into the Arctic. So thank you so much, and I hope everyone has a wonderful evening. Good night.